So it is my pleasure to welcome our first 20-minute speaker for the day, Hillary Barron. And Hillary is from Bemidji State University. I hope I've said that right. And she's going to be giving a talk on culturally responsive undergraduate science education, a training program for justice-focused science teaching. So Hillary, it's all you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm Hillary Barron. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Bemidji State University, way up here in cold northern Minnesota. I am about 110 miles from the Canadian border. So this is my third time attending a BioTap conference. And I just want to say I love this community of scholars. So I'm really excited to be here. So there's really two kind of parts of the story that I want to tell you today. And the first is really kind of about the actual training program itself. And so I'm going to showcase some of the theoretical components. And then the second is about how does this play out for faculty and teaching assistants who I've been working with over the last several years. And so first, this is what you're looking at here. All of these bubbles are the framework for CRUES, or culturally responsive undergraduate science education. And I'm going to go into each of these, what I call domains, in a little bit. But the thread that ties them all together is this yellow bubble or circle in the middle. And the core of it is that we're trying to address issues of systemic and structural racism in science learning spaces. And so I spend time talking about kind of the theoretical constructs because this is both, in a way, a theoretical framework and a training framework. So it's going to feel like I'm throwing a lot of lit review at you, but that's not exactly what I'm trying to get across here. So if we could talk just about kind of this yellow kind of core, what the basic principles of CRUES are, it's that we want to foster positive science identities and experiences for students who have been typically marginalized or whose voices have been excluded, and that we're consistently looking at do those students have a rightful presence in science? And so what I say, and I keep coming back to these kinds of literature, is that inclusivity and inclusion is really the bare minimum that we can do in that space. And that's not at all a knock on inclusivity work or inclusion work. It's just to say that if we want to move beyond the status quo, we actually have to dismantle those systems that actually make inclusivity work necessary to begin with. And so I always say that if I can boil CRUES down to, just like one slide, and this is actually a slide I adapted from or took from Phil Bell, who works in social justice science education for K-12 spaces, it's that students should have a rightful presence across every scale of justice. And scale of justice is a really education kind of jargon term, but what it really gets at is all of our students' intersecting identities. And so not only do students or should students have a rightful presence in STEM across all of their identities, but that we are also consistently trying to interrogate how to desettle the systems that prevent that from happening. And so what are we doing, and what are we doing in those spaces? And so in the CRUES program, in the training program, the first thing we talk about is this basic idea of equity and what does it look like from a social justice lens. And then we really get into the first domain of culturally relevant pedagogy. And Gloria Ladson-Billings really coined the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy in the 90s and basically said, if you're going to be culturally relevant, you teach to the students and for the students who are in front of you. And so in the CRUES program, under the domain of culturally relevant pedagogy, we ask questions like, are there multiple ways for students to demonstrate competency and success? And are you interrogating your own notions of competency, intelligence, and success, interrogating your own potential biases or archaic or outdated views of those things? And so Ladson-Billings said that even if I could tell you how to do it, I'm not going to, because you'd just do that thing. And so kind of the point about this domain that I want to get across is that in culturally relevant pedagogy and in culturally responsive science teaching, you're consistently and always adapting your pedagogy and your curriculum for the students who are in front of you. So there really should be no single semester of culturally responsive science teaching that looks the same. You should always be making those changes. So I want to show you an example of what this has looked like in the past. And I just have kind of like one highlight for each of these areas, just to really tease out what this could look like. And what you're looking at here is an example of an adaptation that an undergraduate teaching assistant named Greg, or pseudonym Greg, used in teaching a lab course. So he was supposed to give students an assignment where they were, interpreting or digesting a typical peer-reviewed science journal article. And this was a predominantly first-generation college student lab. And he noticed as he was getting into the assignment that they were having a lot of issues with it, and that they were feeling very overwhelmed by the idea that they couldn't understand what was happening. So he did this intermediary kind of adaptation where he said, all right, let's look at the Science Journal article, but now think about it from the perspective of how would you describe it if you were talking to other people who are not familiar with science. So he turned it into a science communication exercise instead. And in that process, students went from thinking and expressing things like they felt like they were outside the realm of science, and that science writing was very rigid to them, to feeling like they were expressing science in a way that felt more natural to them and that it matched their own critical thinking skills. So that's a way that an undergraduate teaching assistant adapted in a culturally responsive or culturally relevant way for his particular students. So then next in the cruise program, we move into funds of knowledge, and we go in this kind of order. And funds of knowledge is another education jargon term, but really just gets at, we all come to the table with skills and practices that we have been cultivating over time, and we've been building these things and developing these skills and practices in our own home communities and our own discourses and the ways that we talk and interact with each other, and that students draw on these funds of knowledge as they learn science. So research in the K-12 space, and we're starting to see this in the work that I'm doing as well, shows us that when we can develop meaningful context for students, it improves their critical thinking and problem solving skills. When students can use their own interests in their science learning, they also have greater ownership. And also when students can connect science with their everyday experiences, they also develop deeper conceptual understanding. And for me, both of these things, the improved critical thinking and the conceptual understanding, are really important, because in undergraduate science, we kind of have this battle between covering just this breadth of content and also wanting students to come out of an intro class with really good critical thinking skills. So looking at what this could look like, I want to show you an excerpt from, so this might be a little bit difficult to read, so I'll just give you the highlights. An excerpt from a brochure from an organization called the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And so I'm a descendant of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and that's here in northern Minnesota. And the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people, wild rice is really important to us as a food source and as a cultural staple. And so Glyphwick put out this resource for educators talking about how Anishinaabe people harvest wild rice. And it goes into great lengths about not only the how, but the why, in terms of how we approach things. How did we develop the knocker sticks to get the wild rice off of the plant and into the boat? All of those kinds of things. And it's really just a great example for a way that educators can use resources to bring in other cultures' funds of knowledge. Another example, which is actually maybe even one of my most favorite examples to use, is from Mitch, who was another teaching assistant who was leading a lab in antibacterial resistance. And before he even got started with the lab, before he even got started giving the instructions or anything like that, he just posed this question: what do you know about food spoiling? And he let students talk and let students share out and have conversations about it. And as students were sharing out, it just led to a lot of crosstalk, like just expressing family practices and keeping food from spoiling. So one student said, oh, my dad always puts lemon juice in his apples and puts them in the fridge if he's not going to eat them all at one time, which led another student to say, oh yeah, my aunt uses apple cider vinegar like every night and has never had a stomach problem in her life, which led to a conversation about the gut microbiome. So all of that crosstalk conversation took maybe 12 minutes out of the beginning of a lab and led to the ability for Mitch to say to these students, look at how much you already know about microbiology. Look at all of this vast information that you already know about the stuff that we're going to spend the rest of the semester talking about. And then he was able to consistently come back to that arc over the course of the semester. And it took like 15 minutes at the beginning of one lab. And so funds of knowledge can be, I think, challenging for people to think about and think about how to do, but it's really about making incremental changes and just making small strides and getting to know your students so that you can incorporate these kinds of things. So then in the cruise program, then we move into social justice science issues. And what we do in that space is really to critique this additive nature of science teaching that exists in the United States. So as I was just saying before, we are hyper-focused on content in a very additive kind of way, which tends to only be beneficial to the white dominant group, and it doesn't always it's not always successful at engaging critical thinking. And so incorporating social justice science issues can really connect content and science processes by engaging that critical thinking around social issues. So if we can feature community-based problems as a way to learn science, then we can create spaces where students not only develop awareness, but that they can start to build their own voices as well. And through that process is where we start to think about how can we dismantle colonial education and do so by elevating student voices as they become transformative individuals and transformative, members of the broader community. And so I wanted to show you also a little bit about what this could look like. And what you're looking at here is in a different kind of research group, which I'm going to also show you a little bit more about what these research participants have looked like over the last couple of years. In a different research group, this was a TA faculty pairing situation. And this is an example of ways that group has constructed social justice science issues that they then used and tested out in their own classes. So the first one that you see is the St. Regis Superfund site, which is actually a physical EPA Superfund location here in northern Minnesota that resides on the Leech Lake Indian Reservation. And this is an example that I gave the crew because this is an example I've used in my own teaching to start to get at understanding environmental racism. And then also, I made intentional efforts to show what were the, equitable and rigorous academic expectations so that faculty and teaching assistants could see how do you tie that into what might be your other course objectives. And so, for example, when I do this with my students, it could be an aspect of analyzing data. It could be an aspect of reading, peer-reviewed journal articles. It could be an aspect of predicting or explaining biological or chemical interactions. And so faculty and teaching assistants in that particular research group came up with these examples of social justice science issues. So the myth of race and really thinking about, when has scientific information been misused for social or political gain, and thinking about the myth of race or the social construct of race in terms of talking about racial variation in human genomics. And then also the history of science and really critiquing the dominance of Western science in, ideas of scientific discovery. So I was just, for example, talking with my intro students. We were going through an introductory to Mendelian genetics and had the conversation about how Indigenous people, thousands of years ago in what is now called Mexico, actually engaged in the first practices of looking at cross-fertilization of plants. And so those are just examples that faculty and teaching assistant pairs came up with when we had these conversations of social justice science issues. So what I want to do now, so I did this in kind of an intentionally backward way. So I wanted to give you kind of what this theoretical and training framework looks like. And what I want to do now is synthesize a bit of the studies and the participants that has led to the development and the kind of this evolution of CRUISE over the last 3 years. And so the fall of 2018 was the pilot program for CRUISE. And I worked predominantly with undergraduate teaching assistants. And over the course of the years that followed, the total teaching assistant number in the CRUISE programs and all of the iterations ended up being 40. And in all of those cases, I worked with TAs over the course of 1 hour a week every semester, or 1 hour a week over the course of the semester. And each semester was a new crew of TAs. And then gathered just an extensive amount of qualitative data. And just as a disclaimer, I'm predominantly a qualitative researcher. So what this is probably ending up to look like is just a very enormous grounded theory research, which is fine. And so in addition to the teaching assistants, I also ran a CRUISE iteration or two semesters of a CRUISE iteration where faculty and teaching assistants were paired up in a dyad kind of scenario. So there was 2 cohorts. There were 4 teaching assistants, 4 faculty in each semester cohort. In this case, we met 1.5 hours and we met biweekly. And then adding on to that, now most recently I've been working with faculty at other kinds of regional universities, like I'm at a primarily teaching focused university, and as well as community colleges. So what you're looking at here too, I'm hoping, is seeing a decrease in the total amount of time every week that I've been meeting with people, and let me come back to in a minute why that's been intentional. So over the course of all of these different contexts, all of these different kinds of participants and all of the trainings that we've been doing, as I said, started out in 2018 with the pilot program, really focused on broad conversations of culturally responsive science teaching, and also what can TAs do? What can TAs realistically enact in their classrooms? And from that study and from those conversations really led to the further development of CRUs focused on those three domains, focused on culturally relevant pedagogy, funds of knowledge, and social justice science issues. And then moved into that kind of central focus on social justice, that the yellow bubble that I was showing you at the beginning. And then as I continue this work after the murder of George Floyd, really made intentional efforts to do a lot more scaffolding around that varied perceptions of science as cultural and systemic racism in our institutions. And so then we come back to the kind of laying off on the week to week or the weekly hourly meetings to this idea of CRUs tools, which is really meant to give people a chance to enact modules of CRUs or modules of culturally responsive science teaching without also having to spend a whole semester doing this kind of one-on-one or group-wise professional development. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of the professional development. I love it, but I also understand that people don't always have the time to engage with it in that way. So briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, I wanted to share with you the very big picture, large grain size findings from all of these years of data that I've been synthesizing. And this paper hopefully will be out by the next time we have a conference. So teaching assistants are able to adapt big ideas into specific contextual strategies. And so they've been able to make strides in taking the big theoretical ideas and translating them into things that work for them. And so they really have illuminated that they have shifting ideas of their own role in relation to culturally responsive science teaching. They prioritize relationship building, and they also jump onto funds of knowledge right away. Faculty and TA pairs, as this is probably not surprising news to anybody, hold very varied views of approaches of culturally responsive science teaching and varied views of science as cultural. And so kind of the big findings from there are that faculty incorporate mentoring into their ideas of what is culturally responsive to a greater degree. Faculty and TA pairs both found the experience to be really valuable, but also very challenging. That dyad dynamic was helpful, but also challenging. In emerging results from work due at regional and community institutions, faculty tend to be a lot more forward focused on culturally relevant pedagogy, not just because that's the first thing that we talk about, but because they're very interested in the climate culture in their classroom and really attending to that before digging deep into other issues. And then I do want to just mention super quickly that what I'm seeing of commonly cited barriers across all teaching assistants, across all faculty, teaching assistants talk about lack of autonomy as something that contributes to their inability to enact culturally responsive teaching, or they feel like they don't have their self-confidence is lacking. And they also talk about time. Faculty tend to get overwhelmed by the sheer number and varied cultures of students. They feel like they can't incorporate all of the things that they want to. Also, and this might be a 2020, 2021 thing, faculty are very exhausted by the systemic structures that exist, and also time. And so one thing that has consistently been true across both kind of major groups of people is that time is a limiting factor, or at least something that is an obstacle to try to overcome. Okay, so I'm going to just say that moving forward, this is kind of the goal to do kind of this beta testing of the CRUs tools modules. I'm going to expand it into the EduSTEM network, which is Soya Kotner is the PI of that RCN. And so we're going to extend it in that kind of way. And then hopefully I'll have kind of a live website for you for SABRE of 2022. And I think that I'm running out of time, so I probably won't have time for questions, but please send me an email if you want to chat more, or if I can answer any questions in that kind of way. And I will just leave it at that.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks so much for your talk, and feel free for everybody to give a virtual applause we do have 10 minutes actually until our next talk. So would you be
Okay.
open to taking some questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one, you already touched on it a little bit in the last little bit on your last slide, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on what has been the response of faculty to these types of trainings for TAs. What types of pushback?
Oh, response from faculty, pushback from faculty. So something that's a really interesting story to me, I had a faculty member who joined the dyad cohort in the first semester and actually quite literally pushed back against every single thing that we talked about. So we had all of these conversations and spent a lot of time talking about, perceptions of science as cultural, and that faculty member pushed back against almost every single thing. And also then at the end of the semester, we did kind of this debrief, and my question was, what would you say to faculty who might be hesitant or push back against the ideas of this? And how would you maybe, convince them to think about this in these other kinds of ways? And he said, well, I wouldn't, because I don't think there's anything we can do. And so I was very, very discouraged at that. But then every single person in the next semester's cohort, faculty member, were people in his department that he encouraged to take the training. And so I think that the immediate kind of pushback is, kind of a combination of this reluctance to understand that science is cultural and that science learning is an extension of that. And also kind of that same exhaustion and overwhelming, how do I possibly do all of the things that need to be done? And so then what I will say is that my response to that is, such an important aspect of culturally responsive science teaching is that you are interrogating your own practice. And so that's, even if you can't accomplish every single tiny thing that you want to do every semester, the fact that you're starting to take strides and make progress and interrogating ways where you might be, either holding biases or those kinds of things, that too is culturally responsive science teaching. And so really it's about the small incremental changes. You can't change everything at once, and you shouldn't try to. And you should try to, give yourself a break and give yourself time to adjust to a new kind of teaching and a new kind of thinking about teaching.
Thanks for sharing that. I want to mention a comment that Star Sharp wrote in the chat, and it's something that we noticed that there's this common factor that time seems to be a common barrier regardless of population. And that's interesting because she mentions that when time actually has no race, gender, or religious preference. And that to her means that people are not so good with management of their time. They're all overwhelmed. I think you already talked about how there's one of the strengths is that you're thinking about ways that you're trying to think about what makes it practical concerning these time constraints. You mentioned modules. Did you want to share anything else about how do we make it so that considering this barrier, how can we address this barrier?
Yeah. So I think that, to get back to actually what Beth was saying at the beginning about how to move forward with the BioTap network and how do we think about repositories and sharing information, I think that in and of itself is going to be a key aspect specific to my area of how do we try to eliminate the barriers or the perceived barriers. And that is, we are siloed in our spaces. And like I said, I feel like the work that I do in culturally responsive science teaching is, emerging in undergraduate spaces. But I know that I'm not the only one doing it. And I think that the more that we can come together and, have more RCNs and more collaborative work and more open conversations and sharing of resources, I think the easier it will be to break down those barriers and certainly, break down the perceptions of those barriers.
Thanks for sharing that idea. I don't see any more questions, but I thought I would actually squeeze in one of my own questions.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about your talk is you bring up critical thinking a lot. You mentioned it once about how students have different types of critical thinking and you want to use these cultural responsive practices to match the critical thinking. And then you mentioned deeper critical thinking. So it seems like there's a diversity of critical thinking. I'm interested in how do you define depths of critical thinking and what's the diversity of critical thinking rather than just some catchphrase critical thinking?
Yeah, for sure. And so I think part of why I started thinking about a diversity of the ideas in critical thinking is because when I was really learning about and digging into the funds of knowledge research, that was really about how when students learn and can communicate science in their own home languages, they actually demonstrate a deeper and more critical thought process than students who were just like trying to regurgitate information. But in those early studies of funds of knowledge, there was a perception that because the students were talking in Spanish, for example, they weren't actually, quote, getting the information, but in reality, they were actually exploring it on a deeper level. And that's what actually started me thinking about the idea of there's a lot more critical thinking than we can assess with like Bloom's taxonomy. And then also, especially in the last couple of years, especially with you know, the the fake news phenomenon, the you know, trying consistent attempts to discredit science and the vaccine hesitancy issues, you know, that also got me thinking of that. That's a whole different realm of critical thinking that we probably need to do a better job addressing in at least, well, in all of our education spaces, but particularly for me, I think that, you know, those kinds of critical thinking skills you really need to cultivate in the intro bio courses or intro science courses, because those are the spaces maybe where students they're not going to come back to science after that, especially if they're non-majors. So, so that's kind of how I'm, you know, playing around with that. I'm certainly not gotten into it in a really deep kind of way, but I'm hoping to in the future.
Thank you. Maybe one last question that came up in the chat from Dan Johnson. One of the ideas we have talked about in graduate TA training is enculturating TAs into science education and research. So how do we balance the need for a shared professional culture and crews?
Yes, I think that's a really great question. And that question has come up in other contexts as well. I've done work with K-12 science teachers. And I think that, you know, because that is what people are very, and I think Daniel was saying this too, people are really hesitant and nervous about, you know, any kinds of conversations about race and cultural backgrounds and trying to tackle that in your teaching or in your curriculum or whatever. And I think that part of the answer to that question is we're not saying that we have to understand every single person's background and every single person's culture and then incorporate all of that into what we're doing, but we do make intentional steps to try to get to know the people who are in front of us at the time. And so I think that we, you know, can have a conversation about the broad ideas of how science is cultural and also continue to adapt and make it, you know, tailor it to the people that we're interacting with in that moment in time.
Thank you. I think we should wrap up the Q&A.
Okay.
It's just a couple minutes before the next talk. So thank you so much for taking time to answer some questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it.